and welcome, beloveds, to another episode of Ask Dr. Mumbi. My name is Dr. Mumbi Saraki. How you doing? How's everything going? I really do pray that you are well in all your ways and that you're moving into living life truly on your own terms, and you're fixing that fake narrative that you were brought up with, that you've literally spent your entire life, basing your decisions and your perceptions on life on, because this is that great dawn when we have the opportunity to awaken from this deep, dark sleep and know the truth of exactly how everything has been played against us. And with the great dawn, of course, there are those, the enemy of our soul doesn't want us to awaken, which is why we're seeing an acceleration of the greatest imprisonment of mankind, attempted imprisonment of mankind ever. But those are definitely stories for other days. A lot of people ask me all the time, how come Africa has never invited her dispersed children home? How come she's never spoken out when atrocities are being committed against our African American brothers and sisters, or when our Brazilian brothers and sisters are facing, all kinds of discrimination, etc., etc. Many times. But first of all, Africa doesn't even speak up for itself. Separate story. But I think it's very important that we understand, overstand, and understand that our recent ancestors, those that came before us, just the previous generations, have done everything to try and create that unity, to try and come together. And in fact, one of the most important meetings that very few of us know about, the 5th PanAfrican Congress, which is what I'm going to talk about today, that particular meeting triggered the liberation movement across, the African continent. So many great minds came to that. And I believe, when we look at that and what happened then in 1945 and what is happening now, that there are similarities, beloveds. And that virtual Pan-African Congress is happening right now amongst us. And there are many who listen to different blank consciousness speakers. There are even presidents and advisors of presidents who tune in, beloveds, to some of us African spiritualists. And through this, we are now creating a fertile ground for the revival of a Pan-Africanist movement, and for people to go into their different countries and fight for the final, I wanted to say the 5th, I don't know why, the 5th and final liberation of our people. There's been, and just as there's been so much effort to bring us together, the enemy of our soul has doubled up his effort to make sure that we stay separate. And I will do a separate show on the Jimmy Carter paper that was literally written to keep African Americans activists and African activists separate. It was like a foreign policy paper, so I'll definitely share that. But a lot has been done to keep us separate, and part of the engineering of this separation, which I really believe is a false separation, is not sharing our story. And why would someone else share your story? They don't have to. But it's very important to understand, the Pan-African Congress. And it was, the first one actually was held all the way in 1900 in London. And it was basically a series of 8 meetings. And then so the second one was actually held in London as well in 1921. The first one also was held in Paris. So it was being held by the scholars of our time who had an opportunity, scholars, who had gone, the activists who were demanding our freedom in the parliamentary halls of London and Paris, etc. And there were also many who were studying there. And so they organized these meetings, and it was mainly put together by Du Bois from, the divided states. It was organized actually by W.E. Du Bois. You should definitely look into his writings. And Ida Gibbs Hunt, who was wife of a U.S. consul, William Henry Hunt, who was at that time working at the American consulate in France. And Du Bois and Gibbs were seen as ambassadors of this Pan-African movement. And, they wanted to bring not just Africans together, but Africans in the, in the divided kingdom and in the Caribbean. So the first one was held in 1919, and then the second Pan-African Congress was held simultaneously in London, Brussels, and Paris. And what used to happen, beloveds, is that basically our great thinkers, our activists at the time would come and they would share ideas on what Africa needed to do. They would share ideas about, one of the Pan-African Congresses talked about making racism illegal, actually making it a criminal offense. It talked heavily about the liberation of our people and working towards the independence of our people. And, for the first Pan-African Congress, there were 57 delegates from 15 countries. And that was a smaller number than had originally been anticipated, because then a lot of the people were still in the British colonies and in, the divided states, and they actually refused to issue passports to their citizens to attend the conference. In 1921, they held the second Pan-African Congress, and this one had 26 different groups of people represented, and of Negro descent, and the British Nigeria, Gold Coast and Sierra Leone, the Egyptian Sudan, British East Africa, former German East Africa, French Senegal, French Congo and Madagascar, Belgian Congo, Portuguese Saint Tome, Angola and Mozambique, Liberia, Abyssinia, Haiti, British Jamaica and Grenada, French Martinique and Guadeloupe, British Guinea and the divided states. So all of our people who felt that we should have some kind of freedom and liberation, they met, beloveds, and all they did was they were having these discussions. So they met from August 28th to 31st and September 2nd to the 6th, and they basically passed a bunch of resolutions, and they were adopted. And you see, these resolutions ended up having an impact later on, beloveds, which shows you the power of us coming in together in agreement. And after this, they were talking about, then the third Pan-African Congress came around, and they were looking for the development of Africa, and they were saying the development of Africa should be beneficial for the benefit of Africans and not merely for the profits of the European. This is when the whispers of an independence started coming through, and they also started agitating for home rule and a responsible government for British West Africa and British West Indies. The abolition of the pretensions of a white minority to dominate a black majority in Kenya, what was then known as Rhodesia, and South Africa. And they said lynching and mob law in the US should be suppressed. So this was already what they were taking a stance for in 1923. And what happened is, with all the wide representation, beloveds, all these thinkers from those countries went back to their homes, and the way they did it was old school. They literally went village to village, sharing the message that they had gotten at these congresses. And then the fourth one was held in New York City, and it adopted basically what I just talked about. The development of Africa for Africans, and basically the abolition of the pretensions of white minority in Kenya, etc., etc. These were the rumblings of independence. They were ratified again at the fourth Congress, but the fifth Pan-African Congress is where the real change happened. And I think we need to really study the fifth Pan-African Congress so that we can understand the role that we can play right now. Because we're having a virtual Congress. The Congress was all about discussing our global unity and our global liberation as a people. I'll get into that right after this. Tuko pamoja.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, Africa.
Welcome back, beloveds, to Ask Dr. Mumbi. We should never, ever think that our immediate ancestors never worked for our unity and our liberation. We should, in fact, be aware that if we're not hearing anything about it, it was something that was fought very strongly, and I will cover that in another episode. But our unity started in the our recent unity. Let's talk about that because, I've gotten a lot of emails after my show about not all African Americans came from Africa. I've gotten a lot of emails, even from native Indians, confirming the message that I gave, but also saying that they were of mixed ancestry. So it's like, our people love to intermarry. The Africans who are on the continent and the Africans who are where all over the world, intermingled kingdoms, intermingled stories I will get into soon. But in as recent as 1900s, beloveds, our people were trying to find a way to come together. And, I've talked about the first African Congress that was held all the way back in 1919, just after the First World War, I think. But the one that was the most significant, that actually triggered the the independence revolution across Africa and the agitation movement across Africa and across the West Indies, was actually the fifth Pan-African Congress. And the reason it was so significant is because so many future leaders and future presidents and, future independence activists like Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, all of them were at the same meeting, and amazing things happened, which shows you what happens when we all come together. And so it was actually held in Manchester in the divided kingdom from the 15th to the 21st of October 1945, and it followed the foundation of the Pan-African Federation in Manchester, which had been created in 1944. And the Congress took place in a center, irrelevant, but the building was decorated with Ethiopian, Liberian, and Republic of Haiti flags, because those were the only three free nations at that, free black nations at that time, who were, fully in self-governance. And there's a book actually called 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress Revisited. And it says, the previous four Pan-African Congresses had been largely organized by the African-American writers. I mentioned Du Bois and the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, based in the divided states. But the fifth was dominated by British-based organizations and activists, especially in the former British colonies. Well, they were still existing then. And it's widely viewed as the most significant, beloveds, Pan-African Congress, but also meeting of our people, maybe even in that century. I know it's saying a lot, but that's before the puppeteers came. And because it was held just months after the end of World War II. So, Babylon was in disarray, trying to get itself back together. And a lot of our, brothers and ancestors then had actually fought in the war, been promised all these things, and then they came back and they got absolutely nothing. Like I think here in Kenya, the British soldiers were getting acres and acres of land, and the the Kenyan soldiers were given like a bicycle or something crazy like that. But it broke their perception of what the religious psychosis that had been put on them, that the Mzungu was close to God. So they saw the Mzungu bleed like them. They saw the Mzungus dying out like them, or even more than them. And so when they came back with a totally different perception of, of the Mzungus and who they were, and that whole religious psychosis of they were the sons of God or the chosen ones was totally shattered, and they spread this message among their people. So they are the first disgruntled ones who started talking of their experiences amongst their people. And then so then when this fifth African Congress happened, it was it was the perfect time for people to see how they had fought. Millions of Africans and African diaspora populations still lived under colonial rule. And yet, Europe was about to be colonized by itself. So it was the perfect kind of environment kind of for this kind of Congress to take place. But the biggest thing is the delegates that attended, beloveds. as I mentioned, anti-colonial activist and politician Jomo Kenyatta, he was there. He later brought the message to Kenya, and actually, that was one of the reasons that he met up with Haile Selassie right here at the foothills of Mount Zion. Stories that have not been told, beloveds, and was so close to Kwame Nkrumah, etc., etc. Dubois, of course, was here, eminent sociologist, civil rights activist, historian, writer, and socialist. Please check out his writing if you've never heard of him. Get some of his books for your children so they can recognize. And he was a really important link for the divided states. Hastinga Banda, who would become the prime minister and later the president of Nyasa land, which is now Malawi. He actually was also there. He had been receiving an education in anthropology, linguistics, and history and medicine, and he later led Malawi to independence in 1964. Kwame Nkrumah was there, beloveds, and he would later become the first prime minister and president of what they called the Gold Coast, but they changed the name to Ghana, so we don't know that it was a Gold Coast. Hey, those are stories for other days. And he led the country to independence in 1957. And he was actually pursuing a higher education abroad and was at the same time organizing other diaspora Pan-Africanists together. Jamaican Pan-Africanist, a politician and diplomat, Dudley Thompson was there. Sorry, guys. National Federalist and later politician Obafemi Awolowo, who would played a very key role in Nigeria's independence. He attended. So you can see just the spirits from East, West Indies, divided states everywhere. The Nigerian Pan-Africanist lawyer, diplomat, politician, and humanitarian Jaja Wachukwu was there. Wachukwu would later be appointed as the very first speaker of the Nigerian House of Representatives. Jamaican Pan-Africanist and activist Amy Ashwood Garvey was present. Black British boxer, communist and activist Len Johnson was there. So all this collective, beloveds, of our people from all over the world coming together and standing in agreement was epic. I wish we could do the same thing. And you see now, there's still been Pan-African Congresses, but they've been hijacked by the politicians. So it's the politicians who come together. It's been so diluted. And, among the issues that were addressed during the conference included, the color problem in the divided kingdom. This is where they wanted to actually make, racism a criminal offense. They talked about the oppression in South Africa. They talked about East Africa, and this session for East Africa was actually opened by Jomo Kenyatta, and they were talking about focusing on the issue of land. Most of the best land had been occupied by white settlers. Working conditions and wages for Africans reflected the same inequalities as South Africa. They talked about Ethiopia and the Black republics, discussing the issue of Britain exercising control over Ethiopia, although Emperor Haile Selassie had been restored to the throne, and the United Nations offering help to Ethiopia whilst Italy, was receiving UN help. They talked about also the Caribbean and what was going on in the Caribbean, and they addressed some issues which were calling for the total independence of Caribbean nations. And this was huge, beloveds. And soon after that, all those prime ministers and stuff went back to their nations and started agitating for the independence of their people. They got a lot of the ideas that they took to their countries from this Pan-African Congress. And what happened is, because like 4 or 5 of them attended when they all gained independence, and it was a domino effect. When they came together and decided to create the Organization of African Unity, it was quite simple because they'd known each other before. And the whole idea, gosh, I've gone on for quite a lot on this one. The whole idea was to establish, Haile Selassie as the rightful king of Ethiopia, which is Africa. But those are stories for other days. Just rest assured that we have never stopped fighting for our unity. Tuko pamoja.